How's everybody doing today? This is Noah with The Life of the Zigs, coming back at you with another video on how I built these 8-foot tall barn doors for about $400. So let's get started. Alright, so the first step here was cutting the 1x4s to the correct measurements. This was the 8-foot tall piece, and I wanted to make sure they were all the exact same length, so I brought it down about ½ an inch to make sure they were all perfectly the same length. I used this piece as my scribe piece and stuck it on top of all the other boards and marked all the other boards that way. Then I just put those other boards back up and cut them all to the exact same length. Once all 8 of those boards were finished, I moved on to these shorter sections. I needed to cut 16 of these boards, and to do so I did the same thing I did with the longer pieces. I made a template and used that template just to keep recutting all the other boards. When it came to the material I used a 1x4 pine that was already primed, which even though it's a little more money than unprimed pine, I highly recommend this as painting pine can cause it to warp, which is no good for a barn door as you'll easily see that warp and it will not line up correctly. Once all 16 of those boards were cut, I then took them and drilled pocket holes in both sides of the boards, which was going to be used to screw into the 8-foot long pieces and connect everything together and create that frame. There are a ton of other ways on how to build barn doors, but I feel like this way works the best for me, and it also allows for a very rigid and sturdy structure that makes it almost feel like it's a solid wood door. On a side note, I'll make sure to link this pocket hole jig made by Craig down in the description below. This is a great tool that's great for building anything such as cabinets, doors, or furniture. Now it's time to start putting the frame together. I used a clamp to hold the wood perfectly flush together. Then I used 1-inch long Craig pocket hole screws. Then I just used the square bit that's provided to screw them into the wood. This can be a little difficult as the wood may want to move. I also used some Lexel to kind of glue everything together. Lexel is nice because it is paintable and waterproof. It's just what I had on hand and was the easiest for me to use. Probably construction adhesive would have been better. I just didn't have any on hand, so the Lexel worked out perfectly fine though. Once I had that first board in, I needed to put 3 more boards on, 1 at the bottom and then 2 spaced out evenly in the middle. So I took my tape measure, laid it out, and then measured the 2 center points in the middle for the 2 boards that were going to go in the middle. Once that was done, you also want to make sure to do this on the other side so that they're perfectly level and even with each other. Then you just keep applying your adhesive and screwing the boards into place. Once all 4 boards are screwed into place, you're going to need to repeat this step 3 more times to make a total of 4 frames. One tool that I wish I had here would be a Craig C-clamp. Would be better than the clamp that I'm using right now. It applies a little more pressure, which keeps the wood more flush together. So if you can get your hand on one of those, I would definitely do that. Once all 4 frames are complete, it's time to start laying them out and putting them all together. One big thing you want to make sure to do first is lay 2 frames on top of each other and make sure they line up correctly. Any minor imperfections can be sanded out, however you just want to look for big ones, which thankfully I didn't have any. Then I'm laying out my MDF board. It's super thin paneling I got at Home Depot. It was cheaper than the 1/4-inch plywood they had there, and I also knew that painting that plywood could also cause it to warp or change the shape of it, and I felt MDF would be better since it's a little more flexible than plywood. Moving on, I just need to make a measurement on the MDF board and make a nice rough cut. Basically, I'm going to cut it about a 1/4 inch to ½ inch wider than what it needs to be so that I can come back with a Sawzall and sander and make it nice and flush with the 2 pieces of wood that are together. Now when making the cut, I used my jigsaw to make a nice cut. It is very flimsy, so this is definitely a hard cut to do. However, I just used 2 sawhorses and it worked out well. Once that's done, you're going to move on and use some Lexel or construction adhesive. Make sure to get a nice thick coat all over those 1x4 boards. You should be using at least 1/3 of the bottle, if not even a little more, so you get that nice thick coat. Once you're done with that, make sure you quickly apply that MDF board. And then once that's on, you want to take the other framing, put Lexel or construction adhesive on that, and then smash that down into place. You also want to make sure to line up 2 sides correctly, which is what I did with the far side and the side that I'm walking on right now. And then once it was lined up, as you can see there, I'm applying pressure to make sure everything gets nice and tight together. Then I came back with my brad nailer and brad nailed it all into place, going about every 6 inches apart, 2 nails diagonal from each other. Once that was complete, it was time to cut off the excess edge. I used my jigsaw again and cut it off the best I could. It was a little rough, but that's why you're going to come back with an orbital sander with like a 80 or 40 grit sandpaper, depending on how rough it is, which will get any of those imperfections off. As I just stated, I'm using about an 80 grit sandpaper on this. You may need to use 40 depending on how rough it is. And then once you get a nice rough finish on it and kind of get it how you want it, come back with about a 120 or even a 240 grit to smooth it out a little bit. Sanding is super important for this as it'll give you a nice seamless and flush look. Once that was done, you want to make sure to move on to the next door and get that one complete. Now I am doing some cleanup to the door, getting any of that dust off, and then I'm going to fill in these gaps and cracks with some caulk. I'd let it sit overnight to let that caulk dry, but you want to make sure that you let that caulk thoroughly dry and get a nice good thick coat on there so none of the gaps or cracks are going to show later on once the door is complete. The next day I filled in all the holes from the brad nails and then any imperfections or holes I saw in the wood, as well as the joints of the 1x4s I connected if there was any gaps or cracks in between them. Again, just so it had that nice flush seamless look. Once all that was dry, which took about 6 hours, I came back with my orbital sander and sanded everything down nice and flush and took out any imperfections from the wood filler that I put in. I would recommend sanding all your 1x4s, however, I would not sand that MDF as it's really not meant to be sanded, so that's why I am only sanding the 1x4 pine. You also want to be careful and not take too much off, because if you do, you're going to get beneath that primer and expose that wood. Once that sanding's all done, you want to just make sure to get a nice vacuum and vacuum it all off and wipe it all down so none of that dust is sitting on there when it comes time to paint. Once that's done, you want to make sure to drill all your holes for your hardware, whether it be handles or your mounting hardware. Every hardware is different, so just follow your instructions on where to put the holes. I had already measured it out. I would highly recommend this drill jig. Keeps the bit nice and straight while you're going in, so you'll have that perfect straight hole through, which definitely makes a big difference and a big deal when using and hanging up a door this size, as you want really precise and accurate holes so that everything is plumb and square. Moving on to the handle, it is critical that you have that handle centered from top to bottom as well as left to right on that 4-inch or technically 3.5-inch piece of wood. So you want to take your time and do proper measurements. A framer square makes a huge difference in helping you get accurate measurements, and also a ruler because it's sturdier and not as long as a tape measure. Once everything's all marked out, double check and then get to drilling. Again, this drill jig made by Miles Craft is awesome, guys. It's like 30 or 40 bucks on Amazon. I'll link it down in the description below. And I highly recommend you pick one up if you're planning on building the barn door or just need any precise drilling in general. Once that was done, it was time to start painting. I am using a Sherwin-Williams Extreme Bond primer for the first coat, and then after that for the next 2 coats I will use the Sherwin-Williams Emerald paint, which is what we use to paint all our trim and we're very pleased with, and we also wanted our doors to match our trim for that nice seamless look. To apply the paint for both the primer and the top coat, I used a foam roller that was 4 inches wide and just rolled it on. It doesn't put the thickest coat on, however, it does leave a nice seamless flat coat compared to a nap roller. And for anything that has a gloss finish, the smoother the better. Another option that you could do is spray it. I was in my garage and didn't want to set like a paint booth up to spray it. As you can see, I am hanging it on my garage door railing, which I do not recommend if you only have one garage door and need to use that. However, I could just lock this garage door out and use it that way. I also have screws in the bottom to support most of its weight. Once the painting's done and it had enough time to dry, you can mount your hardware. I chose to mount it in the garage before it was up in the room. All handles are different. This one, I like how it installs. It has bolts that slides through the holes, screws into the handle on that side, and then on the side that you currently see, the handle slides on and gets mounted on with Allen keys. I've had no issues with these handles. I've had them for almost a year now. They don't get loose or anything. They're great handles, so I definitely recommend these, as it also looks symmetrical on both sides. When it comes to the track hardware, the hardest part is drilling the holes. Usually all of them just come with bolts that slide through the holes, and once you slide them through the holes, you just bolt it down on both sides and get them nice and snug. Once all the hardware is done, it's time to take the doors wherever you need to go. I had to go up 2 flights of stairs, so it was kind of difficult being 8-foot long doors. However, they were able to fit as long as I finagled it around some places. Hanging the doors is very easy. You just slide it on top of the tracks. You also need to make sure that you have some sort of guide at the bottom, which just helps keep the doors in place and gives it a nice smooth action, as well as anti-jump discs, which mount on the top of your barn door, and you flip them in line with the door, and it prevents the doors from coming off unless they're flipped out. It's just a safety measure, especially if you have kids that you want to have on there. Well, trying out the doors, they're moving smoothly and everything. Sorry I don't have a video of me installing the hardware on the actual wall. However, there are other videos out there if you want to learn how to do it. It's fairly straightforward. Guys, I hope you all enjoyed the video and learned a lot as I did through this whole process. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know how I did and if I could do anything different the next time, guys. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.